You ever have that one neighbor who just can't mind their own business? The kind who acts like the self-appointed ruler of the entire neighborhood? Well, let me introduce you to Karen, the HOA president who took her power way too seriously. She wasn't just annoying. She was obsessed. One morning, I step outside to grab a package, and guess who I see? Karen. But she wasn't just walking by or making small talk. No, she was staring into my garage, like she was investigating some crime scene. Clipboard in hand, phone at the ready. This woman was fully committed to whatever imaginary rule she thought I was breaking. Now, at this point, I've already had my fair share of run-ins with her. The HOA had been a constant thorn in my side, sending passive-aggressive letters about the most ridiculous things. My trash cans were 2 inches too far from the curb? Fine. My lawn had one patch of slightly overgrown grass? Warning issued. They once even complained about the color of my mailbox. Not because it violated any rule, but because it didn't match the neighborhood aesthetic. So, seeing her snooping around my property wasn't exactly surprising. But what happened next? That was a whole new level of crazy. I step closer and ask, "Something I can help you with?" You'd think that would make her at least pretend to act normal, right? Nope. Instead, she whips around, glares at me, and says, "This garage door is not in compliance with HOA regulations." I look at my garage, then back at her. "What are you talking about?" She huffs like I just insulted her personally. "The shade of white doesn't match the rest of the community. You need to repaint it immediately, or you'll be fined." Now, I know for a fact that my garage door color was approved when I moved in. I even checked the HOA guidelines before making any changes. So I tell her, "Pretty sure this color is fine. And even if it wasn't, you can't just make up new rules on the spot." Karen doesn't like that answer. Her face turns red, and she starts ranting about how she is the HOA president, and it's her job to protect the integrity of the neighborhood. I sigh. "All right. Well, if you have a problem, put it in writing and I'll take a look." Most people would walk away at that point. Not Karen. She crosses her arms and declares, "You need to comply right now." I shake my head and turn to walk back inside. I'm not about to waste my morning arguing about paint colors. But before I even get 2 steps away, she does something I never expected. She pulls out her phone and calls 911. I stop dead in my tracks. Did she really just? I hear her speaking to the dispatcher. "Yes, I need an officer immediately. My neighbor is refusing to comply with HOA rules, and he's being hostile." I stare at her in complete disbelief. Was she seriously calling the police over this? At this point, I could have argued. I could have tried to stop her. But honestly, I was too curious to see where this would go. So I cross my arms and wait, because something told me this wasn't going to end the way she thought it would. You ever had that one neighbor who seems to think they run the entire neighborhood? Well, let me introduce you to Karen, our self-appointed neighborhood dictator. She wasn't just any HOA president. She was the HOA president, the type who believed she had the power of a Supreme Court judge and the surveillance skills of the FBI. And unfortunately for me, I became her latest target. It all started on a regular Saturday morning. I was in my garage, minding my business, organizing some tools, when I noticed a shadow moving outside. I turned around and saw her, arms crossed, eyebrows knitted together in what I can only describe as a permanent scowl. "Excuse me," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of authority only self-important HOA presidents possess. "You need to keep your garage door closed at all times. It's an HOA rule." Now, I had read the HOA guidelines front to back when I moved in. Nowhere, absolutely nowhere, did it say anything about garage doors needing to stay closed at all times. "That's not a rule," I replied, keeping my voice calm. Karen's eyes narrowed. "Actually, it is. It's a community standard. You can check the bylaws." I already had. I knew she was bluffing. "I'll keep my garage open when I need to," I said, turning back to my tools. Big mistake. Karen hated being ignored. She let out an exaggerated sigh, pulled out a notepad, and scribbled something down like a police officer writing a ticket. "You'll be receiving a notice about this," she said. And with that, she spun on her heel and marched away. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. A few days later, I got a letter from the HOA. I didn't even need to open it to know who was behind it. Dear homeowner, it has come to our attention that your garage door has been left open for extended periods. This is a direct violation of HOA community standards. Please correct this issue immediately, or further action will be taken. I laughed. There was no rule about garage doors being closed. Karen had literally made it up and was now trying to enforce her imaginary law. I decided to play nice. I emailed the HOA, asking for clarification on this so-called rule. I even attached a screenshot of the official HOA guidelines, proving there was nothing about garage doors needing to be closed. Their response? The HOA board has the authority to enforce community expectations. Failure to comply may result in further action. That's when I knew this wasn't about rules. This was about control. From that point on, Karen was watching. Really watching. Every time I stepped outside, I'd see her peeking from her window. If I left my garage open for even 5 minutes, she'd be out on the sidewalk, arms crossed, eyes locked on me like I had just committed a felony. Then came the pictures. One day, I caught her standing across the street, snapping photos of my house with her phone. I walked outside. Karen, what are you doing? She didn't even look embarrassed. Documenting violations, she said matter-of-factly. What violations? There's no rule against an open garage. Well, there should be, she snapped. And that's when I realized something terrifying. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules. She was creating them. A week later, I received another letter. This time, it was more aggressive. Dear homeowner, despite previous warnings, you have continued to leave your garage door open in violation of HOA community standards. This behavior is unacceptable. Failure to comply will result in a formal fine. A fine? For what? I wasn't about to let Karen bully me into submission. I sent another email, again asking for the exact bylaw I was violating. Their response? Silence. But Karen wasn't done. A few mornings later, I was getting into my car when I heard someone clear their throat behind me. I turned around, and there she was. You didn't fix the issue, she said. Karen, I already told you. There's no rule. She smirked. Well, there's about to be. That's when I knew. She wasn't going to stop. She wasn't just trying to enforce an imaginary rule. She was trying to change the rules just to control me. And that's when things started getting really bad. You'd think after my last encounter with Karen, she'd back off. But no, this was just the beginning. A week after our last argument, I received an official letter from the HOA. The reason? My garage door was the wrong shade of white. Yes, you heard that right. Not the wrong color, just not the exact shade they wanted. According to the letter, my door needed to match an approved palette, though they conveniently failed to specify which shade was acceptable. I thought it was a joke. My garage door had been the same color since I moved in, and suddenly, it was a problem? But Karen wasn't joking. The letter threatened a $50 fine per day until I complied. I wasn't about to let some power-hungry neighbor bully me, so I ignored it. Big mistake. The very next day, I saw Karen taking pictures of my house. Not just a quick snap. She was pacing in front of my driveway, holding up her phone like she was documenting a crime scene. I stepped outside. Can I help you? I asked, keeping my voice even. She didn't even flinch. Just collecting evidence, she said, tapping her phone screen. We take violations very seriously. I laughed. Evidence of what? My garage door existing. Her lips pressed together. You'll be receiving another notice soon. Then she walked off like she had just delivered some court summons. Sure enough, the next day, another letter arrived. This one stated that my fines had increased to $100 per day since I failed to comply in a timely manner. This was getting ridiculous. Over the next week, Karen escalated her harassment. Every morning, I'd see her standing across the street, watching my house like a security guard on duty. She'd take photos, jot things down in a little notebook, and glare at me anytime I walked outside. One evening, I was grilling in my backyard when I heard a loud knock on my front door. I already knew who it was. When I opened it, there she stood, clipboard in hand, eyebrows raised like she was the queen of the neighborhood. "We need to talk," she said, her voice laced with fake authority. I crossed my arms. "No, we really don't." Ignoring me, she pointed at my garage. "You're violating HOA regulations, and this is your final warning before we take legal action." I raised an eyebrow. "Legal action? Over a garage door?" Her eyes narrowed. "This community has standards. You agreed to follow them when you moved in." I had enough. "Karen, show me exactly where in the HOA guidelines it says anything about the specific shade of a garage door." She hesitated for half a second, just long enough for me to know she had nothing. But instead of admitting defeat, she huffed and said, "You'll be hearing from the board soon." And just like that, she turned on her heel and stormed off. She wasn't bluffing. 2 days later, I got another letter, this time signed by multiple HOA board members. Apparently, Karen had rallied them to back her nonsense. The letter now threatened legal action and possible liens on my property if I didn't repaint my garage door. At this point, I knew I had to fight back. Karen thought she had the upper hand. But what she didn't realize was that I had something she didn't, the law on my side. And I was about to make sure she regretted ever messing with me. You ever have that one neighbor who just can't mind their own business? The kind who acts like they run the entire neighborhood, despite not actually having any real authority? Yeah. That's exactly who I was dealing with. It was a quiet Saturday morning. The sun was out, birds were chirping, and I was enjoying my coffee when something outside caught my attention. At first, I thought I was seeing things. But no, there she was, Karen, standing right outside my garage. Not on the sidewalk. Not near her own property. Right outside my garage. And what was she doing? Oh, just pressing her phone against the tiny garage window, trying to take pictures. For a second, I was frozen in disbelief. I mean, was this real? Was she seriously standing on my property, taking photos of my garage? I set my coffee down, took a deep breath, and walked outside. "What the hell are you doing?" She didn't even flinch. She kept her phone up like some kind of private investigator catching a criminal in the act. "You're in violation," she snapped. "Violation of what?" I asked. "Your garage door. It's not in compliance with HOA standards." Now, let me explain something. My garage door? Completely normal. It wasn't broken, it wasn't painted neon green, and it wasn't covered in graffiti. It was just a standard beige-colored garage door. The same color it had been since the day I bought the house. But Karen? Oh no. Karen had convinced herself that it was the wrong shade of beige. I took a step closer, looking her dead in the eye. "Get off my property," she huffed, dramatically placing a hand on her hip. "I have every right to be here. As the HOA president, it is my duty to ensure compliance in this neighborhood." I was about to argue when I noticed something that made my blood boil. Her feet. She wasn't just standing near my garage. She was standing inside my property line. That's when I realized this wasn't just annoying anymore. This was trespassing. "Last warning, Karen. Leave. Now." Instead of backing off, she did something I never expected. She pulled out her phone and dialed 911. I watched in complete shock as she called the police. And what did she tell them? "Hello? Yes. I need the police immediately. My neighbor is being aggressive and violating HOA policies." HOA policies? She was literally calling 911 over HOA policies. Even the dispatcher must have been confused because she started repeating herself like it would somehow make her sound more reasonable. "Yes, he's refusing to follow neighborhood rules. Yes, it's an emergency." I almost laughed. This was the most ridiculous thing I had ever witnessed. But I stayed quiet, because I wanted to see just how far she'd take this. And sure enough, she doubled down. "Yes, send an officer immediately. He's being aggressive toward me." Aggressive? I was literally just standing there. I shook my head and folded my arms. "Karen, do you even hear yourself? You're calling 911 because you don't like my garage door?" She ignored me, stepping further into my driveway as if she owned the place. Big mistake. Because just as she was still ranting on the phone, A police car pulled up. Oh, this was about to get interesting. A tall officer stepped out, adjusting his belt as he scanned the situation. Karen rushed toward him like she had just been saved. "Officer, thank goodness you're here. I need you to do something about this man. He's refusing to comply with HOA regulations." The cop blinked. Then he blinked again. "I'm sorry. You called us for HOA regulations?" Karen nodded frantically, waving her arms like she was the victim. "Yes, he's violating garage door rules. He's refusing to listen. You have to do something." The cop sighed, already looking exhausted. "Ma'am, this is not a police matter." I couldn't hold back a smirk. Karen's face turned red. But he's breaking the rules." The officer turned to me. "Sir, what exactly is going on here?" I kept my voice calm, measured. "Officer, she's trespassing on my property, taking pictures of my garage without my permission, and now she's wasting your time with a nonsense complaint." The cop frowned and turned back to Karen. "Ma'am, is that true? Are you on his property?" She hesitated, just for a second. I have the right to enforce HOA rules. That's not what I asked. Are you on his property?" She stammered, looking around as if searching for an escape. "Well, technically. No, technically. Yes or no?" Silence. The cop sighed and pinched the bridge of his nose. "Ma'am, step back. Right now." Karen still didn't move. Instead, she crossed her arms and glared at me like I was the problem. "This is ridiculous. I pay my HOA fees. I have every right." "Ma'am, you are trespassing." The moment the officer said that word, Karen's confidence shattered. "Trespassing? I was just..." "Step back. Now." She finally took a step back. But it was too late. The officer turned to me. "Sir, do you want to press charges?" Oh, Karen's jaw dropped. "What?" I shrugged, pretending to think about it. "Well, let's see. She's been harassing me for weeks, invading my privacy, and now she's literally standing on my property taking pictures." "Yeah, I think I do." Karen's face turned pale. "You can't be serious." But the officer just pulled out his notepad. "Ma'am, I need your full name and ID." Karen started stammering again, her hands flailing. I was just trying to enforce the rules. This is a misunderstanding." The officer didn't care. "You called 911 over an HOA violation. That's not an emergency. You trespassed. That is a crime. And right now, you're about 2 seconds away from getting arrested for filing a false police report." Karen's mouth snapped shut. The color drained from her face. She looked at me, then at the officer, then at me again. Then finally she cracked. Fine. I'll leave." And with that, she stormed off. The officer turned to me. "If she comes back onto your property, call us immediately." I nodded. As the cop drove away, I stood there for a second, letting it all sink in. Karen, calling the police on herself because she couldn't handle not getting her way? Now that was something I'd never forget. But little did she know, this wasn't over yet. Because the next time she messed with me, she wasn't getting off so easy. I barely had time to react before I saw flashing red and blue lights pulling up in front of my house. 2 officers stepped out, looking around like they were expecting some kind of crime scene. And there she was, Karen, standing on my driveway with her arms crossed, a smug look plastered across her face. "This is the homeowner," she announced, pointing at me as if she'd just uncovered a criminal mastermind. "He's refusing to comply with HOA regulations, and he's being aggressive." The taller officer, a man with a tired expression, turned to me. "Sir, what's going on here?" I took a deep breath, staying calm. "Honestly, I have no idea why she called you. I was in my house when I saw her peeking into my garage, taking pictures. I asked her to leave and she refused. That's when she called 911. Karen scoffed. "He's breaking HOA policies. His garage is in violation, and I have every right to enforce the rules." The second officer, a woman with sharp eyes, frowned. "Ma'am, HOA policies are not a criminal matter. You can't call 911 over a neighborhood dispute. Karen huffed. He's being uncooperative. I have the right to check for violations. I shook my head. Actually, no, you don't. I stepped back toward my porch, grabbing the folder I had prepared weeks ago when this nonsense started. I handed it over to the officers. Here are my property rights. My home, my garage, and my driveway are private property. She has no legal right to step onto my land without my permission. The officers scanned the documents, their expressions shifting. The male officer looked back at Karen. Is this true? Were you on his property without consent? She waved a dismissive hand. I was doing my job as HOA president. This entire area falls under HOA regulations. The female officer crossed her arms. Ma'am, that doesn't mean you can trespass. The HOA governs community rules, but it does not override state trespassing laws. Karen's confidence wavered. But he can't just ignore the rules. The officer sighed, clearly running out of patience. Let me make this clear. You are not law enforcement. You do not have authority to enter someone's private property without their consent. If he asked you to leave and you refused, that is trespassing. Karen's face turned red. This is ridiculous. You should be arresting him. The male officer exhaled through his nose. Ma'am, I'm going to ask you one more time. Step off his property and leave, or we'll have to take further action. Karen stood her ground. No, he needs to fix his garage. The HOA rules. The female officer pulled out her handcuffs. All right, that's it. Turn around. Karen's mouth fell open. What? You're arresting me? You've been warned multiple times. You're trespassing, refusing to leave, and wasting emergency resources, the male officer said. Before she could argue, the cuffs clicked around her wrists. This is harassment. I'll have your badges for this, she shrieked as they walked her toward the police car. I leaned against my porch railing, watching the scene unfold. So, am I free to go? I asked, amused. The officer gave me a nod. Yep, looks like she's the only one who broke the law today. As they drove off, Karen still yelling in the back seat, I couldn't help but smile. Finally, justice had been served. The moment Karen was handcuffed and escorted off my property, reality finally hit the HOA board. Their fearless leader, the self-proclaimed enforcer of the neighborhood, was now facing actual criminal charges. And trust me, the fallout was glorious. First, the remaining HOA members scrambled to do damage control. Emails were sent, emergency meetings were scheduled, and whispers of legal liability spread like wildfire. They knew that if Karen had been acting on behalf of the HOA, the entire organization could be dragged into legal trouble. I could practically feel their panic from my front porch. But here's where it got even better. I wasn't done yet. After dealing with Karen's nonsense for months, I decided it was time to put the HOA under the same microscope they had used on me. I dug through my paperwork, read every single rule in their ridiculous handbook, and consulted a lawyer. Turns out, they had violated multiple homeowner rights, including harassment and unauthorized fines. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I filed a formal complaint against the HOA. Not just a petty complaint, but a legal one. The kind that forces them to respond in writing, the kind that exposes every shady tactic they've ever pulled. The best part? Once I filed, other homeowners started coming forward. Turns out, I wasn't the only one Karen had harassed. She had a history of bullying neighbors, issuing fake violations, and threatening fines that weren't even enforceable. The HOA, once so smug in their power, was now under investigation. At first, they tried to fight back. They sent a carefully worded letter claiming they had acted within their rights, and that Karen's actions were unfortunate but independent. Nice try. My lawyer shut that down fast. With mounting complaints and a legal case forming, the HOA had no choice but to fold. The fines against me? Dropped. The bogus rules they tried to enforce? Exposed as unenforceable. Karen's position? Revoked. But the cherry on top. The HOA had to cover my legal fees. That's right. The same organization that tried to fine me for my garage violation ended up paying thousands because of Karen's reckless behavior. Their budget took a massive hit, and suddenly, enforcing petty rules didn't seem so appealing anymore. After all was said and done, the neighborhood felt peaceful. No more threats, no more letters, no more Karen lurking around with a clipboard. The HO, once so aggressive, now avoided me like the plague. They knew I wasn't someone they could push around. And Karen? Well, let's just say she wasn't on the HOA board anymore. With her criminal record and a lawsuit hanging over her head, she had far bigger problems to deal with. As I stood on my front porch, looking at my perfectly fine garage, I couldn't help but smile. Justice had been served, and for the first time in a long time, my home actually felt like mine again. And just like that, Karen learned the hard way that the HOA doesn't have unlimited power, and that homeowners aren't just going to roll over when faced with nonsense rules and harassment. This entire situation could have been avoided if she had just minded her own business. But no, she was so obsessed with control that she thought she could twist the rules, invade my privacy, and even involve the police over absolutely nothing. She assumed that, like so many others, I would just comply to avoid the headache. She was wrong. The truth is, HOAs can be helpful when managed fairly, but all too often, they're run by people like Karen, people who let a little authority go to their heads. They make up rules, selectively enforce policies, and bully homeowners into submission, thinking they're untouchable. But as this story proves, they're not. If there's one thing to take away from all of this, it's that knowing your rights as a homeowner is crucial. HOAs might act like they have absolute control, but they're bound by laws just like everyone else. They can't override property rights, they can't make up rules on the spot, and they certainly can't use law enforcement as their personal enforcers. And let's be honest, there's something incredibly satisfying about watching people like Karen face real consequences. She wanted power over everyone in the neighborhood, but in the end, she only embarrassed herself, got arrested, and left the HOA scrambling to cover the legal mess she created. That's karma working in real time. Now, I know I'm not the only one who's dealt with an HOA nightmare. If you've ever had a ridiculous HOA experience, whether it's an unfair fine, an entitled board member, or just plain nonsense rules, drop your story in the comments. Let's see who had the worst HOA experience of all. At the end of the day, the best way to deal with an out-of-control HOA is to know your rights, document everything, and never let them push you around. Because as we just saw, when the right people get involved, justice gets served.